Isabelle Munro was the embodiment of success. At 35, she had everything that most people would consider the pinnacle of achievement: a multi-billion-dollar tech company, a mansion perched atop a sprawling hill with views that seemed to go on forever, and a life filled with luxuries that were the envy of everyone around her. But even with all the riches, she felt hollow inside. There were days when she found herself staring out of her office window, watching the city bustle below and wondering if this was really all there was to life. Her company, Munro Technologies, was known worldwide. It was her brainchild, built from the ground up. Isabelle had poured years of blood, sweat, and tears into creating it, working tirelessly to dominate the market. She had grown accustomed to the boardroom's cold, calculating nature, where every decision was made with one goal in mind: profit. The press loved her investors adored her, and her employees admired her. On the outside, she was the definition of success. But on the inside, there was a void. She was constantly chasing something: validation, approval, or perhaps just the next big thing. But she could never quite grasp it. She had everything, but somehow nothing felt truly fulfilling. Isabelle had always been a perfectionist. She demanded excellence from everyone, including herself. There was no room for error, no time for weakness. It was a high-stakes game, and she played it well. But the more she succeeded, the more she realized that her accomplishments came at a cost. Her relationships with friends and family had faded into the background. She had no time for love, no time for anything beyond the next business deal, the next project launch. Her days were filled with endless meetings, strategy sessions, and corporate dinners. She was always surrounded by people, but she had never felt more alone. It was one late afternoon after a particularly grueling day of negotiations with a major investor that Isabelle found herself standing by her office window once again, staring out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the skyline. It should have been beautiful, but to Isabelle, it felt like a reminder of everything she was missing. She longed for something real, something that didn't come with a price tag or a contract, but she had no idea how to find it. Her phone buzzed on her desk, breaking her reverie. It was a message from her assistant. "You have a dinner reservation at the new upscale restaurant, The Vineyard, at 8 p.m. Isabelle sighed and picked up her phone. Another night of dining with business partners, another round of small talk. She had lost count of how many times she had done this, how many nights she had spent pretending to be happy in a world that felt increasingly foreign to her. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Is this really what I want?" she asked herself. But before she could answer, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from her mother. "I miss you, darling. When can we see each other? I know you're busy, but don't forget about us." Isabelle felt a pang of guilt. Her mother had always been there for her, but Isabelle had become so consumed by her career that she hadn't made time to visit. She quickly typed a response. "I'll try to come by next weekend. Love you." But as soon as she hit send, she felt that familiar emptiness creeping back in. She had everything anyone could dream of, but none of it brought her true happiness. She was trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but disconnected from what truly mattered. That night, Isabelle went to the dinner as scheduled. The restaurant was elegant, the atmosphere sophisticated. The conversation flowed easily, the clinking of wine glasses filling the air. But Isabelle couldn't shake the feeling that she was just going through the motions. The laughter, the compliments, the business talk, it all felt so shallow. She looked around at her colleagues and wondered if they felt the same way. They all seemed to be enjoying themselves, but she couldn't help but feel like an outsider in her own life. It was as she sat there picking at her food that her gaze fell on a man at the far end of the restaurant. He was sitting alone at a small table, his head bent over a book. He wasn't dressed in an expensive suit or surrounded by a group of colleagues. In fact, he looked a little out of place in the upscale setting. But there was something about him that caught her attention. It wasn't his appearance or his wealth, because he had neither, but rather the calm and contentment that seemed to radiate from him. Isabelle couldn't quite explain it, but she felt drawn to him. It wasn't romantic attraction. It was something deeper. Something that she hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity gnawed at her, and without thinking, she excused herself from her table and walked over to him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tentative. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here alone. Are you waiting for someone?" The man looked up, surprised at first, but then he smiled warmly. "No, just reading my book. It's a quiet evening and I enjoy the solitude." He paused as if unsure of how to continue. "But I must admit it's rare for someone to approach me in a place like this." Isabelle smiled, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I know what you mean. I feel out of place here myself." She gestured to the restaurant around them. "Sometimes it all just feels so empty, you know." The man nodded. "I understand. I'm just a single dad. I don't have the luxury of fancy dinners or expensive suits. But I've learned that real wealth isn't about money. It's about the little things. Family, connection, living a life that feels meaningful." Isabelle was taken aback by his words. She had never thought of wealth in that way before. Her entire life had been built around the pursuit of success, of accumulating more money, more power, more recognition. But this man, with his simple life and humble demeanor, seemed to have something she didn't. "Do you mind if I sit with you for a moment?" Isabelle asked, her curiosity piqued. The man gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Of course, I'm Tyler, by the way." "I'm Isabelle," she said, sitting down. They talked for hours that evening. Tyler shared stories about his life as a single dad, about the struggles he faced and the joys that came with raising his daughter, Lily. Isabelle listened intently, fascinated by his perspective. It wasn't the kind of conversation she was used to in the corporate world, where everything revolved around deals and profits. This was different. It felt real, authentic. As the evening wore on, Isabelle realized something. She had been so focused on the idea of success that she had neglected the things that truly mattered. Tyler didn't have a mansion or a yacht, but he had something far more valuable: a sense of purpose, a deep connection with his daughter, and a life filled with love and meaning. Before she left the restaurant, Isabelle felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. She knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep living this empty, superficial life. She had to find a way to reconnect with what truly mattered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Isabelle made decisions that surprised even her closest friends. She started taking more time for herself, for the things that brought her joy. She visited her family more often, reconnected with old friends, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. She learned to appreciate the simple pleasures in life: quiet moments with loved ones, the warmth of a homemade meal, the laughter of children. But more than anything, she found herself thinking about Tyler. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had shown her something important, something that had been missing in her life for far too long. He had shown her what real wealth was. Isabelle had it all. But now she knew that what she had wasn't enough. She needed something deeper, something more fulfilling than the money and power she had spent so many years accumulating. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to pursue it. As for Tyler, he never expected that his chance encounter with Isabelle would change her life. He was just a man doing the best he could for his daughter, living his life the only way he knew how. But in that brief moment, he had given Isabelle something far more valuable than any amount of money: a new perspective on life, on love, and on what it truly means to be rich. Isabelle Munro had always believed that wealth was defined by the numbers in her bank account. It was an easy belief to maintain when the world around you constantly reinforced it. The press celebrated her as a self-made billionaire, and her company's stock price soared every quarter. Her life was a symphony of success, each business deal, each acquisition adding another note to the growing crescendo of her achievements. She lived in a mansion, wore the finest clothes, dined in the most luxurious restaurants, and traveled in private jets. But for all the wealth and power, there was one thing she had never been able to buy: true happiness. She had spent years building her empire, pouring every ounce of energy into her company, Munro Technologies, the tech giant she founded. She had made it to the top through sheer determination, a relentless drive that had turned her into one of the most respected and feared figures in the business world. But the higher she climbed, the more isolated she became. There was always another summit to conquer, another challenge to overcome, but somehow it all felt empty. Her days were filled with meetings, emails, and conference calls. She had a team of personal assistants who catered to her every need, but the human connection she once cherished had withered away. Her relationships were superficial at best, driven by business interests rather than genuine care. Isabelle had become a master at maintaining the facade of success, but behind that mask was a woman who felt profoundly alone. It was on one of these lonely evenings, after yet another exhausting day in the office, that Isabelle found herself standing in front of a mirror in her expansive bedroom, staring at her reflection. Her tailored suit, flawless makeup, and perfectly styled hair were all part of the armor she wore daily. But despite the perfection, there was something missing. A part of her that she had buried so deep she could barely recognize it anymore. Who am I really? She wondered. Is this all I am? For the first time in years, she felt a wave of doubt crash over her. She had spent so long chasing success that she hadn't stopped to ask herself why she was doing it. Was it for the accolades, the money, the power? Or was it because she didn't know how to be anything else? The next morning, as she prepared for another busy day, she decided to make a change. It wasn't something she could explain easily, but it was a sense of restlessness that had taken root inside her. She needed to do something different, something meaningful. That afternoon, Isabelle found herself standing in a neighborhood she had never visited before. It wasn't the kind of area where her high-powered business associates would ever be seen. The streets were lined with modest houses, and the air was filled with the sounds of children playing and people talking as they walked down the sidewalk. The contrast to her world couldn't have been starker. It was here, in the heart of this quiet suburban community, that she would meet someone who would change her life forever. Isabelle had been walking aimlessly when she saw a small cafe on the corner, the kind of place that served coffee and pastries to people who didn't need the extravagance of five-star hotels. She walked inside, the bell on the door jingling softly as she entered. Behind the counter stood a man, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans, his hands busy preparing a coffee order. His face was kind but weary, like someone who had lived a hard life, but still found joy in the small things. Without thinking, Isabelle walked up to the counter and ordered a coffee. The man, who introduced himself as Tyler, smiled warmly and started to make her drink. As he did, they exchanged small talk, and Isabelle found herself surprisingly at ease. It was different from the stiff transactional conversations she was used to in her world of boardrooms and corporate dinners. Tyler didn't seem interested in what she could offer him. He didn't even know who she was. He was simply a man going about his day, doing his best to make a living. As she sat down with her coffee, Isabelle couldn't help but watch Tyler as he moved around the cafe. He seemed so content, so calm in a way that she couldn't quite place. He didn't have the luxury of her life. He wasn't rich, didn't have fancy clothes or expensive cars. But there was something about him that radiated a sense of peace and satisfaction. It was as if he had found something more valuable than all the money and power Isabelle had accumulated over the years. Isabelle felt a strange pull to him, a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. What is it about this man? She thought. How does he manage to live with so little and still seem so whole? She found herself wondering if maybe he had something she had never had, the ability to appreciate the simple joys of life. As the day went on, Isabelle continued to return to the cafe, each time spending a little more time with Tyler. She learned that he was a single dad, raising a young daughter named Lily. Tyler's life was simple but full. He worked long hours to make ends meet, but his focus was always on his daughter. His love for her was apparent in everything he did, from the way he spoke about her to the way his eyes lit up when he talked about their little family. He wasn't focused on accumulating wealth or climbing the corporate ladder. He was focused on something far more important, living a life that had meaning, one moment at a time. Over the next few weeks, Isabelle found herself drawn more and more into Tyler's world. She began to spend time with him and Lily, seeing firsthand how a life rooted in love, kindness, and authenticity could bring so much joy. It was a world far removed from the cold, competitive world of business that Isabelle knew so well. She began to realize that despite all her wealth, she had never truly experienced the richness that came from genuine human connection. One afternoon, after spending the day with Tyler and Lily, Isabelle found herself walking home alone, deep in thought. As she passed through the grand gates of her mansion, the contrast between her world and Tyler's couldn't have been more stark. She stood at the threshold of her opulent home, her heart heavy with the realization that she had been living in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but disconnected from what truly mattered. She thought about Tyler, his simple life, his unwavering love for his daughter, the way he found joy in the little things. He wasn't rich by the world's standards, but he had something far more valuable than she did. He had a life full of meaning. Isabelle had spent so many years chasing success that she had lost sight of what it meant to truly live. That night, as she sat in her mansion, she made a decision. She couldn't keep living this way. She had everything: money, power, status. But she had never felt more empty. Tyler had shown her that real wealth wasn't about the things you owned or the power you held. It was about love, connection, and living a life that had purpose. Isabelle realized that she needed to change, to find something deeper than the superficial success she had built her life around. The next morning, Isabelle called her assistant and began the process of reevaluating her priorities. She would still run her company, but she would make sure that she spent more time with the people who mattered. She would dedicate herself to causes that would make a real difference in the world. And most importantly, she would never forget the lesson Tyler had taught her: that true wealth lies in the love you give and receive, the connections you build, and the moments you cherish. As she made her way to the cafe one last time to thank Tyler, Isabelle felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from a bank account filled with zeros, but the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're living authentically, with a heart full of gratitude and love. Isabelle Munro had spent her life accumulating wealth, but it was only after meeting a poor single dad that she realized what real wealth truly was. Isabelle Munro had always defined herself by what she had. Her wealth, her company, her accomplishments, they were the markers by which she measured her success and, often, her self-worth. She was the epitome of ambition, relentless in her drive to conquer the business world. As the CEO of Munro Technologies, a multi-billion-dollar company she had built from the ground up, she had everything. Or at least that's what everyone else saw. Behind the headlines and glossy magazine covers, Isabelle was living a life that seemed perfect but was, in reality, deeply unfulfilling. She had no time for family, no time for friends. Her days were consumed by meetings, deadlines, and the endless pursuit of more. More profit, more power, more recognition. Yet, when the office lights dimmed and the champagne toasts at corporate events faded into silence, Isabelle found herself alone. She couldn't remember the last time she had truly felt joy, not the kind that comes with a financial win or an achievement, but the kind that comes from something real, something that touched the soul. But it wasn't until she met Tyler that Isabelle began to understand what true wealth meant. Tyler was nothing like the men she had known in her high society world. He wasn't dressed in a sharp suit or driving an expensive car. He didn't have a mansion with servants or a private jet to whisk him away to exotic destinations. Tyler was a single dad. His life was simple, his home modest, and his struggles were a constant reminder of the daily challenges he faced. Yet, there was something about him that struck Isabelle. He had a quiet strength, a calmness that seemed to come from living a life that wasn't measured by how much you owned, but by how much you gave, how much you loved. Their first meeting had been entirely unintentional. Isabelle had found herself wandering through a neighborhood she didn't know, feeling an inexplicable pull to get away from the skyscrapers and glass windows of her corporate world. She had stumbled upon a small cafe tucked in a quiet corner of the city, its charm in its simplicity. It was nothing like the upscale spots she usually frequented, but something about it felt real. She had ordered a coffee, expecting the usual rushed service, the typical indifference of city life. But when Tyler handed her the drink, his smile was warm, genuine. He wasn't trying to impress her, wasn't trying to sell her anything. He just wanted to make her coffee and perhaps share a moment of peace in a chaotic world. For the first time in a long while, Isabelle felt something stir within her, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't long before she found herself coming back to that cafe, drawn not just by the coffee but by the man who seemed so content with what little he had. Tyler didn't care about impressing anyone. He didn't care about her status or her wealth. He didn't even know who she was when they first met. And that, Isabelle realized, was exactly what made him so different from everyone else she knew. Over time, she learned more about Tyler. He was a father to a little girl named Lily, and everything he did was for her. Tyler worked long hours at the cafe to make ends meet, but his priorities were simple: his daughter, his work, and his peace of mind. He wasn't consumed by the pursuit of wealth or success, and yet, in many ways, he was richer than anyone Isabelle had ever met. He had something she hadn't known she was missing. He had a life full of meaning. One evening, after spending another afternoon with Tyler and Lily, Isabelle sat alone in her car, parked outside the cafe. She watched as Tyler and his daughter walked hand in hand down the street, laughing together as they made their way home. The sight of their bond, so pure, so simple, struck her deeply. She had always been surrounded by people, yet she had never felt a connection like the one they shared. It was a reminder of what she had sacrificed in her relentless pursuit of success: real, authentic relationships. For the first time in a long time, Isabelle began to question her life. She had everything that the world told her was important. She had money, power, recognition. But in her pursuit of all these things, she had lost sight of the things that truly mattered, the things that Tyler seemed to understand so clearly: family, love, connection, purpose. The next day, Isabelle made a decision. She would no longer define herself by her wealth or her business. She would redefine success, not as the accumulation of material things, but as the ability to live a life full of meaning. She wanted the kind of wealth that Tyler had, the kind that wasn't measured in numbers but in moments of real connection. Isabelle knew that she couldn't change her entire life overnight. She still had responsibilities as CEO of Munro Technologies, and there was no denying that her company was her legacy. But she also knew that she couldn't continue down the same path of isolation and loneliness. She needed to find balance. She needed to start investing in the things that truly mattered. She began by carving out time for herself. She took long walks through the park, something she hadn't done in years. She visited her family more often, reconnecting with them in ways she hadn't in years. But most importantly, she began spending more time with Tyler and Lily. It wasn't about business or networking. It was about real connection, the kind that filled her soul instead of her bank account. Tyler never once asked for anything from her. He didn't need her money, her status, or her approval. He simply allowed her to be herself, to experience life in a way she never had before. One afternoon, Tyler invited Isabelle and Lily to their small apartment for dinner. The apartment was modest, but it was filled with warmth. The walls were adorned with handmade drawings from Lily, and the smell of a home-cooked meal filled the air. Isabelle sat at the table, surrounded by the simplicity of it all, and felt something stir within her. She had spent years in cold, sterile boardrooms and luxury hotels. But this was different. This was real. As they ate, Tyler talked about his day, about the little moments of joy he found in his routine. He talked about Lily's latest drawing, the way she had made a picture of their family, a picture filled with bright colors and joy. Isabelle found herself listening intently, absorbed by the warmth of his words. There was no talk of business, no concerns about profits or deals. There was just life, the simple, beautiful mess of it all. Later that night, as Isabelle left Tyler's apartment, she couldn't help but reflect on everything she had learned. Tyler had shown her that real wealth wasn't about what you had, but about what you gave. It wasn't about the deals you closed, but the relationships you nurtured. It wasn't about the power you wielded, but the love you shared. Tyler's life was simple, but it was full. It was rich in ways that money could never replicate. For the first time in years, Isabelle understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. It wasn't about the things you owned. It was about the people you loved, the lives you touched, and the moments that made you feel alive. Tyler had shown her that real wealth isn't measured by how much you have, but by how much you give. Isabelle's journey was just beginning. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer chasing the wrong kind of wealth. And in that, she had already found something far more valuable than anything money could buy. Isabelle Munro had built an empire. As the CEO of Munro Technologies, she commanded respect in boardrooms filled with powerful men, and her face graced the covers of business magazines. She had everything that most people could ever dream of: wealth, influence, luxury. Her mansion was a palace, her wardrobe a testament to high-end fashion, and her calendar packed with meetings, conferences, and lavish dinners. But in all of this, there was a truth she had long ignored. Despite the accolades, the riches, and the success, Isabelle was profoundly empty inside. She had always thought that wealth and power would bring her happiness, that the world's admiration and the ticking numbers in her bank account would be the things that made her feel fulfilled. And yet, every night, as she sat in her cold, empty penthouse overlooking the city, she felt a gnawing emptiness that no amount of money could fill. The lonely echo of her footsteps through her mansion was a constant reminder that no matter how much she had, it was never enough. It wasn't until one fateful evening that Isabelle began to question everything she had built. She had just concluded another meeting with a high-profile investor, one that would propel her company to even greater heights, when she found herself standing outside the cafe she had stumbled into a few weeks earlier. It was a small, humble place, and yet it felt like a world apart from her usual circles of wealth and power. The first time she had entered the cafe, it had been an impulse, something that caught her off guard in the middle of a city where everything was shiny and new. The man behind the counter, Tyler, was not the kind of person she would normally associate with. He wasn't wearing a suit or carrying the weight of corporate responsibilities on his shoulders. He was just a simple single dad, trying to make a life for himself and his daughter. Yet there was something about him, something that pulled her in, something that made her realize she had been living her life all wrong. Isabelle had spent so much of her life avoiding vulnerability, burying herself in work, in acquisitions, in contracts, and in the never-ending race to stay ahead of her competitors. But with Tyler, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. His life was modest, simple even, but there was a contentment in it that Isabelle had never experienced. As she sat with him and his young daughter Lily, she began to understand the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't the private jets, the stock options, or the designer clothes. It was something deeper. It was love, connection, and living with purpose. Over the weeks, Isabelle's visits to the cafe became more frequent. She found herself looking forward to the conversations she had with Tyler, learning from him in ways she never expected. Tyler never sought anything from her. He didn't know who she was. He didn't care about her business empire or her wealth. To him, Isabelle was just another person, a woman who needed something more than what her life had to offer. He treated her with a kindness and humility that she had never known, and in his presence, Isabelle began to feel the weight of her own life, the weight of her wealth, her success, and her isolation. One evening, after spending hours talking with Tyler about everything from his struggles as a single parent to his hopes for his daughter's future, Isabelle found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in years: the desire for something real. She was so used to controlling every aspect of her life, to keeping up appearances, to wearing the perfect mask of success. But with Tyler, she didn't need to be anyone other than herself. And for the first time in a long time, Isabelle realized she was tired of living a life that was defined by the things she owned. She wanted to live a life defined by the people she loved and the joy she could give. As Isabelle continued to spend more time with Tyler, she found herself drawn deeper into his world. She began to see the simplicity of his life and the richness it offered. Tyler's daughter, Lily, became like a breath of fresh air in Isabelle's life. The little girl's joy, Her innocence and her pure love for her father were a stark contrast to the cold, transactional relationships Isabelle had spent years building. It was impossible not to be moved by the bond they shared, and Isabelle couldn't help but think of her own life, so full of possessions, and yet so devoid of connection. One night, after a particularly long day at the office, Isabelle went to Tyler's apartment to help him with some errands. The apartment was small, humble, but warm. It was filled with the laughter of a child, the soft hum of a life well lived. There were no opulent decorations, no expensive artwork on the walls. Instead, there were drawings from Lily, framed photos of their small family, and the warmth of a home that Isabelle had never truly known. As she sat down at the kitchen table, watching Tyler cook a simple dinner for them, Isabelle felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had spent so many years focused on building her empire, on accumulating wealth and power, but here she was, sitting in a modest apartment, surrounded by love, kindness, and a family that had no need for the things she had spent her life chasing. Tyler set a plate in front of her, and for the first time Isabelle truly tasted food. Not just in the way that food satisfies hunger, but in the way that it nourishes the soul. She looked at Tyler, and for the first time she saw the richness in his life. It wasn't about the size of his paycheck or the luxuries he could afford. It was about the life he had built with love, with purpose, and with integrity. He had something that she had lost along the way, the ability to live fully in the present, to appreciate the small moments, to find joy in the simple things. After dinner, Tyler walked Isabelle to the door, and as they stood in the hallway, he looked at her with a quiet smile. "You know, Isabelle," he said, "life isn't about what you have. It's about who you have in your life and how you make the world better by being in it. You can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have love, if you don't have a reason to wake up every morning, what's it all for?" Isabelle felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't known it then, but in that moment she understood what real wealth was. It wasn't in her bank account. It wasn't in the boardrooms or the deals or the acquisitions. It was in the love she gave and received. It was in the relationships she nurtured, the lives she touched, and the purpose she found outside of her empire. That night, as Isabelle left Tyler's apartment and walked back to her mansion, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she wasn't just walking through life taking what she could get. She was walking towards something more meaningful. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that it wasn't going to be defined by the same things that had driven her for so many years. She had everything, but for the first time she realized that true wealth wasn't measured by what you had. It was measured by how you lived. Isabelle Munro had spent so many years chasing the wrong kind of success. But in the quiet humility of a poor single dad and his daughter, she had finally found what she had been searching for all along.